Chips! Hey everyone, here's Bogdan from Shift Studios. Today, I'll be showing you how we created a small and easy material transition in Blender 3.0 that you could use for any of your projects. So, let's get started. So, here we are in Blender. Let me first of all just activate the screencast keys so you can see what I'm doing around. Then, I would like to create a separate collection for the camera and lights, like I always do. You can call it camera and lights or whatever you feel like. Now we can go to camera view and then change to render mode. I would like to move the default cube just above the red line, the x-axis. And now let's make a background for it. So press Shift A, mesh, and let's make a plane. Let's make it a bit bigger so that the camera can have some space to play around with. Just like this. Now let's apply the scale. And I want to check that the plane and the cube are really close so that I get a nice shadow. Sometimes it can look weird, like your cube is levitating, and we don't want that. Now let's move a bit the camera. And now I'll move the light. I'll change the angles so I can find one that I really enjoy. I'll take the light just a little bit down, and I really like this angle. I'll keep it like this. Now let's move on to view. I'd like to change the samples for render mode to 128 and for the view to 64 so that we can solve a little bit of banding. And I'll turn on bloom, ambient occlusion, and screen space reflections. Also, I'll go to the shadow and I'll do the cube size and the cascade size up to 2K. And if you'd like, you can play around with the soft shadows, high bit depth. Usually this makes the shadows, well, softer. And if you'd like, you could go for more rough one. But I like them soft, so I'll keep them like this. Now let's go to the light bulb and I'll activate the contact shadows because it seems like there's some parts of the shadow missing and it corrects it. And I also like to change a bit the color maybe. This looks a bit weird. I'll just keep it to straight white. Now we can select the cube and it has already applied the base material. We can work with this one. I'll just change the name first to base and glow. And then what I would like is I'd like to change the principal BSDF to an emission shader. Now we can actually start to play around with the color and you can choose whichever one you'd prefer. I think I'll go for a goldish one. Yeah. And if I take the strength up, you can see that it's shining brighter than before. And if you can take it down, then it's to the base color. So what we will do is combine the principal BSDF with the emission shader. So let's change back to principal BSDF and then we can add by pressing Shift A, going up to shader and then emission shader. Now you can see that if we drag the BSDF to the surface or the emission shader to the surface for the material output, we can see whichever one we choose, but we can actually do this faster by using a really powerful add-on. It's the Node Wrangler. So we go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then we activate the Node Wrangler. Now, if I press Ctrl-Shift right-click, we can see the shader directly, and I can change it up really fast like this. So what we would like is to use a mix shader. The mix shader combines two shaders between them for a certain factor. So if it's up to 1, then it will use the second shader, and if it's on 0, it will use the first shader. So technically it works, right? Well, not yet. What we also have to work around is how to use the factor. So let's add a color ramp. And then we can plug the color ramp right into the factor of the mix shader. Now let's move a bit the sliders so that they're pretty close. This amount is just perfect. And then I'll change it from linear to ease. It just makes the transition between the two materials a little bit easier on the eye. Now, by pressing Ctrl-Shift-T, I created a texture mapping, and then we get rid of the texture and then plug the vector right into the factor of the color ramp. Now we can actually play around with the coordinates on the y-axis, z-axis, and x-axis. And by using this method, we can actually switch between the materials through the factor. And you can see that if I go from ease to linear, it's much smoother in ease mode. That line right there. Now we can actually play around with the scale and the orientation and rotation, but first of all, let's change it to object instead of UV. And then we can play around with the scale of the segment, that's the transition, or we can actually do it in one shot. We could just animate the rotation and the position of the texture, and that would be it. But what I'd like to do is make it a bit more interesting. So let's give it a 95 angle on the Z, and then just like this on the y-axis. Let's make a triangle from the view. That's perfect. And then let's take it down to 0.3. And yes, that's what we're going for. So now we could just make a triangular transition starting from the center of the camera angle. And there you go. That would be the first version of the transition. We can also get back to the principal BSDF and take the roughness up a bit. It doesn't have to be 1. We are searching actually to give it a bit more contrast. This looks good. So now let's have a look in the layout. All right, and then we can actually go to animation. Now we can take the Y location up to 2.62 in my case, if you followed the same sizes and location. I would also like to get another screen so that I can set it up as a timeline so that I can have a better view over the keyframes that I'm setting up. So here we are, and then I can just press I by hovering the Y location so that I can set up a keyframe, and then I go 60 frames up, and then we take the value down until we are certain that it's the right amount. I'll just roll around a bit to see if the light reaches, yeah. And it works just like it was supposed to. Now we actually have the animation ready. Now, well, you might not be able to see the keyframes that you set up if you don't have selected the actual mapping, because this happens when you use keyframes on certain attributes that are not selectable by selecting the whole object. So if you'd like to play with animations regarding a shader, you have to click that exact shader. Now, what we could do more for the animation is change the interpolation mode for the keyframes. So we could try with a cubic or maybe the back one, but I think I'll just stick to linear for this animation. But this isn't actually what you saw at the beginning of the video, right? So I'll show you how I made the animation for just that tiny line from the whole cube. So we select the cube in layout mode and then we go to front view, edit mode, and we press Ctrl R for loop cut and then scroll the mouse wheel up so we get 2, and then I'll scale it down a bit. And this feels good. And then we go to the vector group tab and click on the plus sign, and I'll call this one the glow line. And with the vertices selected, press assign. Now we can go back to the material tab and then assign the base and glow material, and then we can create another new material and we'll call this one just base. For this one, I'll just turn up the specular to 1 and then roughness to a high value so that we have a lot of contrast. Then for the line of vertices selected, press assign for the base and glow material. Then we can actually press by hovering over the view, Control I, that inverts the selection that we currently have, and then we can assign to this selection the just base material. Now get out of edit mode and then we go to the camera view and play the animation. And as you can see, now the animation for the material is restricted to only that stripe that we have selected earlier. Now, all that remains to be done is to actually change the position of the material on both keyframes. If you don't like it the way it is, you can actually delete the keyframes since there wasn't anything complicated on them. And then let's start from frame 1. We can move around on the y-axis and then maybe change the angle, the material, to make it a bit straight. And then move the initial position on the x-axis and the z-axis to be this point. Now, when you play with the position of the material, it will look like it's actually filling out the line. So I press I, then go to 60 frames, then turn up right here. That's a good endpoint. Now that we selected these 2 points, we can actually change the interpolation to exponential, so it would be a bit more dramatic. It actually works just like a spring. It charges up and then boom, it explodes into the animation. It will also make the whole animation a bit shorter, so keep in mind that. Just for the sake of showing you the effect, I'll keep it to linear, but most of the time I like to add some interpolation types to my animations that fit the story, but for now we'll just keep it to linear. What I also like to do in this short animation is change the angle that the line comes in and follows through. So in the beginning, I'll change the angle for it to be accelerating, and then I want it by the end to decelerate a bit. So let's go for this, and yes, this works. If you want to add something extra to your art, well, you can actually go and play around with the bloom, or maybe you would like to take down or maybe even up the shadow, cascade size and cube size, or maybe you would like another resolution. I chose the full HD one, but you can go for square. Also, be sure to have the right frame rate for your animation. I'll go for 30 frames per second. And when it comes to rendering, what I do recommend most of the time is to do a PNG sequence, since it's easier to edit one PNG or maybe even 10 of them rather than going around and re-rendering your whole animation. If you found a glitch or maybe something that you don't like, you can just replace it with 30 frames or 20 frames that you recomposed. You should also make a habit out of saving up your files and maybe setting up backups from your preferences tab. You can actually set up saves once every minute or 2 minutes. If Blender crashes, then you have work that can be recovered easily and you don't lose much of your time. So yeah, those are my tips. Now we are ready to render. And here is the final result. I really hope you enjoyed this new tutorial, and more will be coming up soon. So if you enjoyed it, please leave a like, share and subscribe to our channel so that you can see every video that we are uploading on a weekly basis. So that is it. Have a nice day and see you next time. Bye.